over in this session, so I will go ahead and start. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here for day 2, session 3, our final session of Queer MiniCon. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you to everybody who's been here through this entire process. Queer MiniCon has been phenomenal so far, and thank you so much to the ambassadors that I see in this space, because you all were the ones who had this idea that turned into Queer MiniCon, which I think has been really phenomenal. So thank you so much for everything that you all have done. So we are going to have a slightly different session than some of the previous ones because 2 of our presenters are not here. So they sent in videos, but they are not going to be here for the Q&A. And so we're going to be passing back and forth between pre-recorded and live facilitation. We are going to start with pre-recorded. So let me pull this up. Okay. Let me try to pull this up. Okay, here we go. So this is Curtis Smith, who is an undergraduate student at UNC-Chapel Hill, who has a 5-minute presentation. So I will go ahead and start that.
Hi everyone, my name is Curtis Smith, and I'm a senior psychology major at UNC-Chapel Hill, and I wanted to spend this time to talk about a study I'm proposing called Disentangling the Differential Impacts of Trauma and Stress on Risk-Taking Behavior Among Sexual and Gender Minority Youth. Now, my initial interest in this topic stemmed from the antithesis of queer-identifying youth being both overrepresented in the juvenile justice system, but understudied within research. And in the United States, about 35% of people identify as queer, while they represent about 20% of the juvenile offender population. And after doing some more digging, a lot of research has supported that queer youth are more likely to be homeless and, by proxy, more likely to be arrested. However, I was curious to see if there were more proximal risk factors that could make queer individuals more likely to engage in risky behaviors like substance use or delinquency. Now, recently, trauma has been identified as a robust risk factor of future offending, especially in adolescence. Now, trauma can refer to any physical, social, or emotional abuse, and has been linked to maladaptive behaviors, poor emotional development, a lack of social skills, and even poorer health outcomes. And studies have shown that queer youth disproportionately experience traumatic events at much higher rates than heterosexual cisgender individuals. And this signaled to me that queer involvement in the criminal justice system may be caused by this trauma impacting their behavior. And I also wanted to examine how social stress may play a role in that relationship. Youth in general are much more prone to experiencing socially stressful situations, whether that be due to romantic relationships, peer pressure, or the stressors of emerging adulthood. And as a highly stigmatized group, queers may experience minority stress that may make them more susceptible in these stressful situations. And I think looking at how a history of trauma and stress interact would better distinguish the mechanisms through which trauma can impact risky decision-making. And now that I've laid the groundwork, I wanted to discuss how I plan on testing this. So my goal would be to recruit undergraduate students because they are at a unique place in life that encompasses a lot of stress and opportunity to engage in delinquency. To measure their trauma, I'd have them complete the Child Youth Wellness version of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire, which inquires about the amount of adverse experiences they've had at home and at school, the 2 primary social environments for adolescents. And participants would also complete a demographics questionnaire that would include open-ended sections for them to report their sexual and gender identities. Then, participants will be randomly assigned to either the stress or no stress condition. Participants in the stress condition will complete the Trier social stress test. The first phase of the task will have participants taken into a room with a panel of 3 Confederate judges in addition to a video recorder. They will be given 5 minutes to prepare a presentation and given a sheet of paper to help organize their thoughts. The next phase will be the 5-minute presentation, during which, unbeknownst to them, they are not allowed to use the paper they are writing on. And so throughout the presentation, the panel of judges will maintain neutral expressions and urge them to continue until the entirety of the 5 minutes have passed. Participants in the no stress condition will completely skip this task. And what this task is designed to do is induce stress participants. Now, immediately afterwards, all participants will complete the balloon analog risk task. an empirically supported measure of risk-taking behavior. The BART task presents participants with a balloon, and they're given a chance to earn money by pumping air into the balloon by clicking the mouse. This offer continues up until a certain threshold, at which point the balloon will explode. If the balloon explodes, they'll lose all their earnings, but if they stop before it explodes, they get to keep their earnings. And so each pump confers a greater risk of explosion, but an increased potential to be rewarded. Participants complete this for multiple trials with the threshold changing each time, testing their willingness to take risks despite their growing awareness for the danger associated with their actions. And here's a model of how I've pretty much conceptualized this relationship. We see trauma identified by ACEs impacting the risky decision-making, and we see both queer identities and stress altering the strength of this relationship as moderators. My hypothesis would be that more adverse experiences would equal greater risk-taking, and that effect would be more pronounced in queer identifying youth, especially under stress. And so overall, the major takeaways of my study are that I want to acknowledge the presence of queer individuals within the juvenile justice system and illuminate the impact of their unique experiences on their engagement and risky behaviors. Hopefully, my findings will evoke continued research in this particular population. And I think the dearth of this research that currently exists only serves to perpetuate the non-existence of queer people within the juvenile justice sphere and minimize their vulnerabilities to traumatic experiences in their home and social environments that put them at a greater risk for delinquent behavior. Even within the greater community, recognizing how potent trauma can be in this population can encourage a greater emphasis by families and educational institutions alike to take a more active approach in establishing an accepting, safe, and positive environment for queer youth as early as possible. Thank you all for listening to my presentation.
All right, and so thank you so much to Chris for sending that in. So now I'm going to hand it over to Ashton Thorne.
Hi, give me a second to share my screen. Oh no, I don't know how to use Google. Okay. Hello, I'm Ashton. I'm very queer and I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. In addition to being really passionate about LGBTQ topics, I am very into music. I grew up as an internet emo and then got involved in punk in high school, and more recently I've gotten into the goth scene on top of that. But one mainstay of my music taste for many years has been queercore. I do want to preface this presentation by letting you all know that I will be using slurs and curses when they are historically and or culturally relevant. Also, please note that every scan of a zine included in this presentation, unless otherwise noted, is from the Queer Zine Archive Project, which you can visit at qzap.org. Queercore is a subgenre of punk music that arose in the 1980s. Punk, as you may imagine, is already a counterculture attractive to many queer people, with its working class history and anarchist politics and DIY ethic. Like most subcultures and niche movements, especially queer ones, it's difficult to pinpoint queercore's exact beginning. G.B. Jones and Bruce LaBruce's zine JDs originated in Ontario in 1985 and is commonly credited with kicking off the queercore movement, originally giving it the name of homocore, which pretty quickly evolved into queercore to signify the radical leftist political stances of queercore communities, and in order to explicitly include queer people that the label of homo doesn't necessarily fit. JDs came from Toronto, which is arguably the first hub of queercore, quickly followed by San Francisco and Portland. The JDs zine highlighted songs with queer themes, featured photos of beautiful men in leather. Sorry, I got a notification and it distracted me. Reviewed albums and encouraged punks to create more music centered on queer experiences. And what do you know, they did. But I'll talk about the actual music in a bit. I want to talk about zines and other things first. There are a limited amount of actual academic articles on queercore, including Redefining the Body Electric by David Ensminger and Mapping Subversion by Robert DeChain. I have read them and they provide an interesting perspective, but honestly, they come across to me as very sanitized. Academic resources on queercore, something inherently underground DIY, subverting the already subversive, just don't seem genuine. It's difficult for peer-reviewed articles with DOI codes to truly reflect a counterculture born of vulnerability, anger, and zines filled with essays on anarchism and erotica. As someone who's read old queercore zines for years and was tossed around in a pit as a bunch of trans people screamed "True Trans Soul Rebel" when I was 15, reading citation-heavy academia just doesn't really do it for me. Digging into primary resources is a lot more rewarding. Zines alongside music and individual lived experiences are the best primary resources for queercore. The overlap makes sense. Zines are a relatively common interest among queer people and their DIY, so they're also common in punk scenes. I've spent hours, probably days or weeks collectively, looking over QZAP, the Queer Zine Archive project, which I've already mentioned. It hosts 7 issues of JDs and dozens of other queercore zines ranging from the mid-80s to zines they were sent last month. If you're interested, I would highly encourage just searching queercore or punk on the QZAP website, but be warned that many are explicit in both language and imagery. Some titles of zines that I personally love are, of course, the JDs, How I Learned to Love Myself and Occasionally Other Men, Homocore number 2, and Now I Twist Your Nipples with a Pair of Spaghetti Tongs. I also enjoy anything including Anonymous Boy art or a Pansy Division interview. The names can be ridiculous. Welcome to Queercore. There are an extensive amount of queercore zines, and bigger zines often do reviews of other zines, which do reviews of other zines, and so on. A good transition from talking about zines to talking about music would be Outpunk. Outpunk began as a zine created by Matt Wabinsmith in the 1990s, and it ran for 7 issues. None of them are fully accessible online, at least from what I can dig up, but there's a few scans of them on queermusicheritage.com. However, they are all in the Outpunk collection on the 3rd floor of an NYU library, along with LPs and EPs and band tees from the 90s, and if I can ever visit those archives, I will burst into tears. What makes a song or a band queercore is mainly 2 aspects: a punk sound, so raw, harsh vocals, upbeat, quick tempos, drums, electric guitar, oftentimes DIY production, and the embracing of queer political themes, lyrics, and aesthetics. A lot of queercore music blatantly reclaims slurs, unapologetically bashes homophobes and transphobes, and separates itself from mainstream gay assimilationism. Queercore also heavily overlaps with anarcho-punk, street punk, and riot girl punk. To dig a little bit deeper into the music, I'm separating my music recommendations into 3 arbitrary categories that I have created. The first is proto-queercore, punk music with queer and political themes that existed before the terms homocore or queercore were even coined. This is music that appeared in early volumes of JDs that discussed songs and bands that dealt with queer themes before the genre itself was really solidified. After that, we've got what I'll label core queercore, which is music that exists specifically to fill the queercore niche, with bands often made entirely of queer members, bands that were interviewed in later issues of JDs or Homo Punk World or similar zines, bands on the Outpunk label, generally bands formed with the intention of being queercore groups. Some of these groups are still active today, and core queercore groups are the bands often highly influential for what I am calling contemporary queercore. Contemporary queercore maintains the anarcho-queer, anti-assimilationist themes of queercore, but it's a little bit more experimental in genre while making largely punk and sometimes post-punk sounds, which I'll discuss a bit more when I get there. So here come my recommendations. This is by no means comprehensive, and if you want to email me or DM me somewhere, I can probably give you personalized queercore recs. For the purposes of this, I have chosen just a few groups from each of my arbitrary categories to give you a diverse base of recommendations and a solid sense of what each of my unofficial categories are. Proto-queercore, Patti Smith, while more known for influencing Riot Girl, is influential for a lot of punk artists. And if you just take a look at her androgyny, it's not hard to see how she influenced queercore, especially considering Gloria from her debut album, Horses. The Dicks are another proto-queercore group. They're an 80s hardcore punk band with an openly gay frontman, which was not as common at the time, and most of their pre-hiatus music is from before homocore was coined. While they may seem like any other hardcore punk group, sometimes they performed in casual drag, which was not that common, and a lot of their songs have heavy queer themes as well as leftist ones, as you can probably tell from this slide you're seeing. So a nice overlap between proto and core queercore is a list of songs in Homo Punk World #1 from 1997, which includes both queercore music meant to be queercore and older punk music with heavy queer themes. I did make a Spotify playlist out of all the available songs from the zine, if that sounds up to your alley. Moving on to core queercore. Team Dresch is a group that's really close to my heart, as they occupied the beautiful overlap of Riot Girl and Queercore, and their front person contributed to the JDs, Outpunk, and Homocore zines. While they're often written about as an all-woman band of lesbians, their drummer, Marceo Martinez, actually came out as transmasculine and questioning pretty recently. Their sound is grungy while maintaining a high-energy punk feeling, and their music is oftentimes emotional, dealing with themes of loneliness and belonging and everything in between. Pansy Division is kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. They're a group of mainly gay men with playful and frequently sexually explicit songs. Their songs are closer to power pop punk than they are to hardcore, but their unapologetic queerness and commitment to unconventional masculinity makes them a lot of fun to sing along to. Faggotron is a less well-known, but their music is somewhere between old school punk, thrash, and hardcore, but definitely queercore. Most of their songs are really short, and they're all radically queer, even when you can't exactly tell what they're screaming about. I think a quote from their lead singer that sums them up pretty well is, "We were never a gay band, we were always a queer band." A good bridge from core to contemporary, in my opinion, are collections of queercore put together by various people in the queercore scene, as well as tiny DIY labels. The first one of these came from the JD's zine, which you can see on the left. And it was a 1990 cassette tape titled JD's Top 10 Homocore Hit Parade Tape, which is a terribly long title. It consists of 10 songs that Bruce LaBruce and GB Jones chose that, to them, exemplified homocore. I consider myself pretty good at internet excavation, and I am unable to find a rip of it anywhere, which makes sense, as the original mode of acquisition was similar to how one procures zines. You sent $5 to LaBruce and Jones, and they would send you back a cassette tape. One cassette does seem to live in the alternative Toronto archives, which is another place I would probably cry if I ever got to visit. A more accessible compilation is called Stand Up and Fucking Fight For It, Queers in Hardcore and Punk. It is from 2001 and put out by Agitprop Records. My favorites on this album are Long Way by Lip Candy, In Stitches by Moss, and Burn Your Rainbow by the Skin Jobs. You can find the album on Spotify, and I would highly recommend giving it a listen if you want to get into queercore. So moving on to contemporary modern queercore. Dog Park Dissidents. I adore the Dog Park Dissidents. The majority of their songs are really heavily political, and they stick pretty strictly to a hardcore DIY punk sound, which I love. I once made my friend listen to their entire discography while we were making vegan brownies, and I'm purposefully wearing their shirt today, which matches the screen a little bit. My favorite songs by them are probably Rainbow Drones and Queer as in Fuck You, which is the namesake of my 8-hour hundreds of songs long queercore playlist. Danny Denial is another one of my favorite current queercore artists. They are Black, queer, and non-binary, and they sing about their overlapping identities and experiences with a sound that sometimes brings in a darker, more gothic sound, some electronic elements, and a heavy dose of really beautiful personal lyrics. Also, all of their music videos are masterpieces. Gloss, which stands for Girls Living Outside Society's Shit, was a short-lived but really powerful hardcore punk group that made up of, I believe, entirely trans women. Most of their music reflects this and is really angry, fast-paced, and really good to scream along to if you ever are angry. And that is all the time I have, but I hope I've expressed, queercore goes so far beyond the few bands that I mentioned today. This is a picture of me in a Gloss shirt, which is relevant to the last slide, and the other photo is a piece of art from Blot Number 2, which is a zine from 1994 that I just couldn't fit in any of the other slides, but I really like it, and it's very relevant to queercore. So that is all.
All right, thank you so much. I feel like I just learned so many things, and also I had no idea that there was so much overlap, since I am now going to go ahead and be the next presenter, and I'm going to be talking about zines, though I'm going to be talking about Star Trek fanzines. So let me get that pulled up. All right. I'm gonna figure this out, y'all. Hold on. Okay, here we go. All right, so basically what I am doing here today is I'm going to talk a little bit about research that I did from 2014 to 2015. First, to introduce myself. Hello, I am Dr. April Callis. I'm the Assistant Director of the LGBTQ Center. I am presenting today similar to what A said in a previous session. Because of a little bit of pressure, I feel like the ambassadors put on me when they were going to be presenting their topics and asked me to present some of my own research. So here I am. So I'm going to be trying to boil down a couple years of research on Kirk Spock fan fiction into now 9 minutes. So this research that I started in 2014, what I was looking at is what can Kirk Spock fan fiction tell us about cultural constructions of gender and sexuality in the United States? Why Kirk Spock fan fiction? Because I've been reading it since I was 14 years old, and I really wanted to get a chance to do research on something that I was super passionate about. So my background is I'm an anthropologist, and so for this research, I oftentimes called myself a fanthropologist and felt very clever about that. I will give you a brief history of Kirk Spock fan fiction. So this started in 1974. So Star Trek was a TV show that was around in the late 60s, was canceled in 1969. And so by 1974, you start seeing Kirk Spock fan fiction. So fan fiction that is positing a sexual and or romantic relationship between Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock of the USS Enterprise. The first story, Fragment Out of Time, is only pronouns. It's really hard to tell what's going on. It was published in a grup zine or a grown-up zine, and people didn't even realize what was going on. But once they kind of put together what it was, it started a conversation around the premise. And so this would be talked about in fanzines as I am for or against the premise. By 1978, you get the first anthology entirely about Kirk and Spock. And you also start seeing this label of slash. And what that meant was these things would be written as Kirk / Spock, the slash meaning it was about a sexual or romantic relationship, as opposed to K and S, which meant friendship. So when you would go to a convention, you would ask if people had any slash. If they didn't know what you were talking about, they would say no. If they did, they would slide it to you under the table. Anyway, by 1985, more than 30 Kirk Spock zines were being published per year. And by the mid-90s, much of this had moved online. So the research that I got to do, I did interviews with readers and writers of fan fiction. I did participant observation. So I went to KissCon in Seattle, which is a convention entirely dedicated to the relationship between Kirk and Spock, and got to present there and interview people. It was amazing. But the heart of my research was reading 6,000 pages of Kirk Spock fan fiction. And I will say it was always my favorite thing in the whole world. After reading it, analyzing it, reading it again and again, and then writing an academic article, it kind of has ruined Kirk Spock for me. I'm hoping one day I can go back. I've had to take a break. We've been on a break for a few years now. But a big part of the analysis I was doing is I was comparing the fan fiction written about Kirk and Spock that was written in the 70s and 80s to that which was written in 2005 to 2014. And I was curious, the characters had stayed the same. So what had changed? How were people writing about this differently? And what could I then learn about our culture in the ways that we've shifted in how we think about same-sex relationships? So what I found is that there are multiple differences in the ways that gender and sexuality are written about in these fanzines, in these stories in the 70s and 80s versus how they're written today. And I'm going to talk specifically about some of these findings. So the first is that stories that were written from 2005 to 2014 contained much less homophobia. So there were less assumptions of homophobic reactions. So if people found out that Kirk and Spock were in a relationship, in the newer stories, there wasn't always this like fear that something terrible was going to happen if Dr. McCoy found out about it. And also there's just less blatant homophobia. So in stories written in the 70s and 80s, there's oftentimes slurs that are dropped. Oftentimes Starfleet Command tries to kick them out because of their relationship. And you just see this happening much less often now. Also, Kirk is not so openly homophobic in stories that were written in this later period. So oftentimes in the stories from the 70s and the 80s, his backstory is he's a captain but was born and bred in Iowa. And so there was this like idea of him as this like Midwestern, really conservative human when it came to sexuality in some of these older stories that you just don't see anymore. And if you want to know more about this particular part, I've written an entire article that you can go and read about it. Another main difference is that stories that were written recently, being gay isn't the entire plot point. So in these stories written in the 70s and 80s, the entire plot was, oh my God, Kirk's in love with Spock. What does it all mean? And they would take however many pages it was to work through all of their angst about that. Whereas now it's like, they are in love with each other, or they have sex with each other, and also they go to planets and they have adventures. And oftentimes the point then is the adventures that they're having, not the fact that they are gay or in love with each other, however they identify. So being unstraight is no longer the major plot line. So something I found really interesting is that in stories written from 2005 to 2014, gender is less often tied to sexuality. So in older stories, when Kirk, it was generally the Captain Kirk character, realizes that he is sexually or romantically attracted to Spock, he starts wondering, like, what does that mean? But I'm a man, but I'm a captain, but I am a manly man. I can't possibly be in love with another guy. And that is like a huge part of the angst around these stories. And so you see that 4 times as often in stories written in the 70s and 80s as you see it now. Also, there are a lot of ideas, there's a lot of misogyny in older stories, but there's also this idea of being anally penetrated is somehow feminine or makes you less of a man. And so that's oftentimes something that the characters are working through in the 70s and 80s, where they're interested in having this sort of sex, but what would it mean for their masculinity? And you really don't see that at all, I think, in one of the stories that I read in the newer period. So that was all of the stuff that I've kind of officially analyzed and written articles about. But I told you all that I would also talk a little bit about some of the other random things that I haven't written about yet, but that are sitting in piles of data for me to one day maybe get around to. So one thing is that the individuals writing these stories in the 70s and 80s clearly didn't know a lot about the mechanics of 2 cisgender men having sex. So lube is 5 times as likely to be around in the newer stories versus the older stories. So there was a lot of anal sex happening without lubricant in these older stories. Also, prostates are something that individuals now oftentimes will write about in some way, mentioning it during sex scenes, whereas you didn't see that in older stories. Also, there was an awful lot of sexual assault that was happening in those older stories that you don't see now. And some of this might be that every fandom seems to go through different waves of themes. And so I don't know what that tells us about culture. Maybe it tells us something, or maybe it's just that was kind of a trope that was more important then. But you see that trope coming up in other fandoms, like in the 90s or early 2000s, and then it seems like fandoms kind of work out of it. There's also this point that I have wanted to analyze that I haven't gotten to yet, is that certain tropes persist. And there's this idea in both older Kirk Spock fan fiction and newer stories that's very gendered and feels very much like a romance novel, where Spock is oftentimes the confused virgin who is swept off his feet by Kirk, who is portrayed as this like very super stud, lots of experience, and really goes hand in hand with like a typical romance novel and the way that those very heteronormative relationships are written about. So I would love to analyze that at one point, because that does persist, but I haven't gotten to that yet. And the last thing that I promised people that I would talk about, something I think is really interesting is going from that old fan fiction until now, you can see certain fan tropes that were created and how they persist. So in 1979, the very first Kirk Spock fanzine, there was a picture drawn of Spock's genitalia that included double ridges. And this became a thing and passes on until now. About 20% of stories include these double ridges, but when I interviewed authors of the fan fiction now, they have no idea why. They don't know the history behind it. They don't know anything about this fanon, but it's just true to them. So I find that all very interesting. Okay, and now I am out of time. But so in conclusion, I think that there's a lot of changes that you can see in fan fiction. that mirrors some changes of what's going on in broader US culture in the way that we understand sexuality. Being LGBTQ is more accepted now than it was in the 70s and 80s, though certainly we still have a long way to go. And in some ways, perhaps we've been moving backwards recently. Open homophobia is less accepted at this point. So for example, using slurs in general is something that we see less in supposed polite conversation, though heteronormativity clearly still remains. And gender and sexuality are more often understood to be separate things now than they were 30 or 40 years ago, though you definitely still see overlap. So, all right, and here is all the links to the amazing fan art that I've been showing you all, and all of them can be found at Dr. Fumbles McStupid Tumblr, which, yes, is my Tumblr account. So just, I will put that link so that you all can see that. But all right, thank you so much for your time. That was a lot, apparently. Okay, so now our last presentation is by Elliot Kimball, who is the Assistant Director of the Office of Intercultural Engagement at UNCG. And so Elliot has sent us a video. And so I'm going to be showing that. And so it's a little longer, it's 13 minutes. He promised me that it was 10 minutes and that was a lie, but we're gonna show the full 13 minutes. So, okay, once again, let me share screen.
Hello. Oh, so responsive. I love it. I wanted to introduce you to a place you probably do not know you are in right now, which is the Heteronormative Matrix, okay? That's where you are right now, and I am thrilled to be your tour guide. As Dr. Ali said, my name is Elliot, and we're going to be moving and meandering our way through the heteronormative matrix today, okay? So please note the emergency exits, okay? And also that, per usual, someone who is vulnerable to the impacts of heteronormativity must also bear the burden of educating the unaware majority. Okay, lovely. So we're first going to need to go over some concepts that are critical to our tour today. Consider these your safety regulations, okay? Not available in the seat pocket in front of you. Sorry, budget cuts. Chief among these would be heteronormativity. Now, what am I talking about when I say heteronormativity? I am talking about the widely accepted and normalized belief that heterosexuality, predicated by sex as assigned at birth, is the default, and thus, relationships between opposite sexes are most fitting. Now, we could never hope to untangle these heteronormative ideals from our daily lives because they are so normalized, which is why I chose to introduce this topic to you through the metaphor of the Matrix. Pulled from the popular 1999 premiering sci-fi trilogy, we follow our hero, Neo, as he discovers that all of humanity is unknowingly trapped in a simulated reality called the Matrix, which is very casual if you ask me. You look surprised. You didn't know your entire reality was constructed and defined for you? Don't panic. It's okay, I understand. In the words of Morpheus, our immortal deity from the Matrix films, I can see it in your eyes. You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to wake up. No alarm clock here. This tour is just beginning. Now, we have to take care of some more business. I cannot allow you to navigate the heteronormative matrix unlabeled, okay? Consider the heteronormative matrix a stuffy and painful networking event. We've all been to those, right? That may have been what intermission was like for you, okay? And you all have to wear a name tag. And I'm sorry, but that name tag has to detail every single one of your identities, yet someone else gets to pick those for you. Real. What if you don't identify with your sex as assigned at birth? What if you don't check every single box necessary to adhere to a particular gender? What if you experience attraction to people that would not be perceived as identifying as the sex opposite of yours? Well, my friends, you might just be a little queer. Now, I must warn you, identifying as queer is not welcome in the heteronormative matrix. That's not because people don't care about you. It's simply because the system was not designed with you in mind. And nobody can replace the system. Now, we've talked about heteronormativity, so what is queer? As an adjective, it can describe something odd or strange, but as a verb, it illustrates the action of spoiling or ruining something. And that I like. Yet, when we consider the relatively recent cultural revolution around the word queer, I think the second definition is more fitting. Queerness is here to spoil and ruin everything you have been taught to believe about gender, gendered expression and sexuality, and the myriad of ways in which heteronormativity infiltrates our daily lives and our society. While as an identity, queer can encompass many things, theoretically, something must exist in a state of total normalcy or acceptance to be influenced by queerness. Don't worry. Here in the heteronormative matrix, we work aggressively to protect you from such queer influences. You are safe. If you haven't caught the gist by now, queer is a dirty word, okay? And I say that even as somebody that works with college students on a daily basis and have seen this celebration around the reclamation of the word queer. And even when I see it in such a positive light every day, it still irritates something deep down inside of me. It still stings like a synonym for weird or lesser or other or targeted or threatening. And it still echoes like school hallways and reverberates with the judgment and discrimination of peers of mine that are considered to be socially dominant. If we could somehow remove the stigma and lift the social pressure around the permission to be more queer, I have a feeling that it would feel something like coming up for that first breath of fresh air after you've spent a long time underwater, just to prove to your friends that you could. If we could somehow remove the stigma and lift the social expectations and reprogram the norms, the exception might just become the rule. Queerness is the antibody to the heteronormative condition, and stories of queer success are battle cries in an ongoing resistance. However, living in violation of the heteronormative matrix is not safe, and thus there are a few other things you should know. The heteronormative matrix is non-threatening to most, unfriendly for some, but for the most vulnerable can be deadly. Here in the heteronormative matrix, for queer young people aged 18 to 24, suicide is the second leading cause of death. The average life expectancy of a transgender woman of color is 35 years old. 1/3 of transgender Americans report eating and drinking less to avoid having to use a public restroom. 40% of homeless young people are queer. And 70% of those queer young people that are homeless identify as Black or Latino. And at the present moment, there are just north of 300 active hate groups just here in the Southeast. While the matrix is fake, the hate and impact generated by heteronormative culture is very real, even if the rules it is based upon are not. So you might be thinking, what rules? Well, if I ask you to think about what it means to be a man or a woman, you may think of a childhood movie or television show or a youthful crush or some key element of your upbringing. But you most likely do not think of this omnipotent, omniscient, universal truth giver, because that doesn't exist. When I ask you to think about where you learned these things, and if you've ever been confronted by transgender identity and had that little voice in the back of your head that said, I wonder if that person is a real man or woman. Who decides? Because if it is our Division of Motor Vehicles and their related identity documents, I think we are all doomed. Now, if it feels like this tour is attacking everything you know about living as a gendered and sexual person, it probably is. Okay? You'll be just fine. As we learn early on in the Matrix, the system defines reality for a lot of people. It is that system that is the enemy, not necessarily the people. And as we also hear in the immortal words of Morpheus from the Matrix films, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. They are so inured, so hopelessly dependent on the system that they will fight to protect it. Now, we are all programmed to believe certain things and take certain things as universal truths. But we have to think about the dangerous part of that. And the dangerous part of that is when we are not questioning every identifiable sign that our society was built for some and not for all. And we need to remember that. For many guests on our tours of the heteronormative matrix, they first have to unlearn before they can relearn. So much of what we are taught is divisive, and it programs our conscious and unconscious bias whether we want it to or not. Chances are you are statistically more likely to be nodding your head in agreement with me right now because you perceive me to be a man. Only my mother found that funny. Now, we are nearing the end of our tour. I know, it's a sad day for me too. So I must ask you to make a choice. An active choice as to how you are going to move on living your life from this place. You may feel like this is a whole lot for you, and you might feel like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. And luckily for you, because of how the system works, you can write my talk off as the musings of an overworked, underpaid, progressively liberal snowflake, and you will wake up tomorrow believing that. Or you can take the last 10 minutes as permission and encouragement to consider the system. Consider this idea of the heteronormative matrix and think about the ways you might be able to live your life just a little differently for the betterment of people who may identify differently than you do. When we know better, we can do better. And when we unlearn, we can relearn. I encourage you to find spaces where you are the minority, especially if you have never experienced that before. I encourage you to listen more than you speak, particularly if your identities allow you to speak more than others. Yes, church. I want you to feel encouraged to do research around identities you do not understand. And I want you to question everything, especially if you have never had to worry about simply sitting and existing safely in a space because of one of your identities. I want you to tell your story. And I want you to encourage other people to tell theirs too, because if you don't, one will be written and told for you. And lastly, I want to encourage you to get a little queer today. And I don't mean who you love, right, or who you are, but in terms of challenging that little voice in the back of your head that probably sounds a whole lot like the heteronormative matrix we toured today. Challenge that. Dig deep below all of those socially constructed expectations down to the most authentic version of yourself. LGBTQ+ or not, Living without apology in our current world is a direct assault on a system that prescribes everything from who we love to how we dress. And that, my friends, is beautifully queer. Now, on your way out, the gift shop is on your right, okay? And for your convenience and affirmation, everything down to the writing pens for sale has been segregated by biological sex. Have a lovely day.
All right, so Jacob, did you want to end with a memorial or a remembrance?
Yeah, sure. This will only take a couple of minutes. But I wanted to start off by thanking you, April, and everyone who put this on. This was amazing, and everyone pulled it together in a record time. And so thank you, everyone. Thank you, all the panelists. I think this bodes well for maybe doing this annually, maybe? I don't know. But great. So I just wanted to end this wonderful 2-day queer mini conference by taking a few minutes to remember the work of the late Randall Kenan, a beloved professor in the English and Comparative Literature department, who passed away on August 24th, and just have a moment of silence in his honor, just for a little bit at the end of this. So Randall Kenan's body of writing explored the intersections of Black, gay, Southern identity, which he himself embodied, and according to one of his fellow writers, warlike ornaments, and his loss to the UNC community is immeasurable. Randall Kenan was born on March 12, 1963 in Brooklyn, but was raised by his great aunt, Mary Kenan Hall in Chingapin, North Carolina. When Kenan matriculated at UNC as an undergraduate, he initially studied physics, but was drawn to fiction writing under the guidance of a teacher, Max Steele, who was also a professor in the English and Comparative Literature department. Professor Kenan graduated in 1985 with a bachelor's degree in creative writing, and he initially worked in publishing, joining Random House and rising to an assistant editor at Alfred A. Knopf while working on his first award-winning novel, A Visitation of Spirits. He then left publishing to teach, took posts at Vassar College, Duke University, the rival school, Columbia University, Sarah Lawrence College, and the University of Mississippi, Oxford, before coming back to UNC as a faculty member in 2003. At UNC, he taught creative writing and food writing. Professor Kenan's 1992 collection of stories, Let the Dead Bury the Dead, won the Lambda Literary Award for gay fiction. His other honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Whiting Award for Emerging Writers in 1994, and in 2005, Kenan won a North Carolina Award for Literature, the state's highest civilian honor. His most recent fiction, the short story collection, If I Had Two Wings, was just released in August, the same month he passed away. In the years between his short story collections, Professor Kenan wrote nonfiction, including Walking on Water, Black American Lives at the Turn of the 21st Century in 1999, for which he traveled the United States to explore what it meant to be Black, a biography of James Baldwin for young adult readers, and The Fire This Time in 2007, a commentary on race inspired by Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. He also edited The Cross of Redemption in 2010, a collection of Baldwin's unpublished writings. In Professor Kenan's last published piece, which appeared in August on the website Literary Hub, he wrote about the increasing outcry against Confederate statues in the South and their removal. And I'm going to put a link to that timely piece in the chat and encourage everyone who hasn't read that to read it. I also encourage you to learn more about Kenan's writing and legacy by those students, colleagues, and friends who knew and loved him by visiting the English and Comparative Literature Department's website, which I'll also put a link to in the chat. All right, I'm gonna do that right now before I forget, and then we will have a moment of silence to close out Queer MiniCon. Okay. I also, if you would like to learn more about Randall Kenan, the Department of English and Comparative Literature is also having a celebration of his life next Wednesday, the 21st at 5 o'clock. So I encourage you to go and attend that. All right, and now we will have a moment of silence. Thank you. Thanks for this wonderful, wonderful con.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for being here and for all of the hard work from all of you that went into this. It was amazing. And some of us have a 9 o'clock meeting now, so we're gonna go. But look for all of these videos to be up, hopefully in the next week on the QMC website. So, bye.